Well, good afternoon again, everybody. It is Friday, the 17th of July, 2020, and welcome to this afternoon's Endless Studios live stream. I'm Brian, and with me, as always, is Natalie. Hello,
That's right.
Natalie.
Hey, Brian, it's good to be back with you. So excited to talk to you about game making today on Friday.
It
Coming in
is
hot at the end of the week, right?
it is Friday. It is the end of the week, and I think we want to kind of hit things pretty hard today because we want to make sure we get through some stuff and leave ourselves in a good place with our VR shooter mod project that we've been working on as we go into the weekend. So far on that project, we have been playing our game that we're going to modify, coming up with design ideas. We've done a little bit of a breakdown of the different design ideas and what it would take to do them in terms of some of the specific steps and the level of effort it would take to do some of those steps. We've got a bit more of that today. But I think, Natalie, our goals for today are to complete that, to come up with the definitive list of the things we want to do as part of the mod. And then I would say come up with an implementation plan for how we're actually going to go about doing those things. So specific steps at a high level where we haven't outlined those yet. And also, breaking down the order in which we're going to try to do things. And I think if we can accomplish that, I would feel really good going into the weekend. And I think anything more than that, if we actually got into maybe working on some of the stuff in the implementation, would be a bonus. But that feels like a pretty decent agenda. Would you be feeling? I would feel good about that. Would you feel good about that?
I would feel great about that. Yeah, I'm really excited to get into some project stuff today. And I know yesterday it was so fun because we got sucked into playtesting that great GameStar mechanic game by Ms. Rogers. And there's nothing I love more than playtesting. But I think we got to put our money where our mouth is and actually show these guys some of the game making chops that you and I have. And yeah, I want to get creative and dive into Unity a little bit if we can get there.
All right, challenge accepted. I would like to prove my game making chops. So let's hunker down and let's do some of that. So let's dive right in. I'm going to bring up the list that we've been working off of on the last couple of casts of potential features. We've gotten through most of this list, Natalie, in terms of spelling out what those features might be and what we're going to prioritize. But and there were a few items where we said we need some design work. We need a little preliminary design work at least before we could say, well, how much would this take and what exactly would we be doing here? So let's start by polishing off those items. And I think there are two in there, one right after the other. So right now is this notion of the game currently being endless. So again, the enemies keep spawning, you keep defeating them until you lose or you decide you've had enough and you give up. Could we make that a finite was one design suggestion. And then beyond it just providing you with some feedback, could your score that you get, you get points every time you defeat an enemy, could your score affect the gameplay in some other way? So I think we should address those from a design standpoint. Natalie, I'll start. Thoughts on those? Any inspiration there design wise, or should we just talk it through?
Yeah, I didn't have any major inspirations last night. My sense of the second one, though, in just sort of thinking out loud here is, of course, I start to think about money, because we
Yeah.
had brought up the idea of a store, and so the way my mind goes when you say having your score affect the game in some way, I start thinking that you're earning money that you can use to buy things, or accumulating some type of resource that you spend later. And, I go a little bit into the fact that we said, buying upgrades is like an extra large task. And so it makes me wonder if you have any other ideas that might have come up for you last night, or even just talking through it now, that would be like other ways score could affect the game besides earning money.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that analysis in that I think actually going the full nine of having a currency system or having a store where you could buy things, that feels super scopy, as we say. That feels like that would be a lot of effort. And so I lean away from that, and I think trying to find another way we could do this would be better. Before I get into that, I just want to quickly do one of our typical reminders, which is if you're in the program and you're watching the stream right now, please do say hi in the chat. So we know you're here. We give you a shout out. So I was looking over the list last night, and I had sort of a thought. I don't know if it's a good thought, but it's a thought nonetheless, which is one of the things you often try to do in good game design, or I get really working on any kind of a software project, is when you have different ideas or suggestions, you try to find a way to unify them. You try to find a way to sort of bring them together. And that's what I was trying to do. So we've had this, and this was my thought, we've had this idea hanging out there of having the enemies spawn in waves rather than randomly and continuously as they do now. So here's my thought on how to tie in the wave idea with the making the game more finite, and I think even with the points having a more meaningful effect on gameplay. What if you did this? What if instead of the game, and actually with one other design suggestion we have, so what if instead of the game being infinite and continuous like now, you had the enemies spawn in waves, and you had the game consist of a finite amount of waves. And what was triggering a new wave to start was hitting certain milestones in your score, right? So once you got a certain number of points, a new wave, perhaps with more enemies or enemies spawning more frequently or more difficult enemies, would start, right? And so maybe they wouldn't be, maybe waves is the wrong word if you're doing it like that, but let's just say more generically like phases to the gameplay. And you actually did that and got some more formal phases in and got more of a sense of like the difficulty increasing over time, because perhaps the very final wave could be like a boss fight, which would tie in the notion of having a boss type enemy as well.
That's such a cool idea. I really like that. I mean, I can kind of imagine like a newer player who finds this a little bit scary and overwhelming, which it really is if you've never played VR before, even if you're an experienced gamer, coming in and, not earning points as quickly and having more time to operate and practice in that lower difficulty phase. Because, of course, the points as a means to determine when phases switch is sort of an implicit timer. But you kind of are controlling the timer a little bit, where it's like, oh, I'm actually giving myself more time by just not accumulating points as fast as somebody else would who's better at the game. And thereby I'm giving myself more time to practice the game before I end up in a harder phase. So I really like that idea because it's sort of helpful to different kinds of players. The flip side is a really experienced player who's not at all afraid of being in VR and just hops right in there can get through that early stage of gameplay where it's not very challenging quickly and get on towards the gameplay that's going to be really fun and interesting for that player.
Yeah, it's got sort of a built-in sense of balancing to it where I don't worry, because anytime you're going to make a mod like this and you're going to make changes, that one of the questions that's worth asking is, if I do that, is it going to radically affect the gameplay? Might it throw everything out of balance where suddenly the game gets really, really hard or really, really easy in a way that sort of breaks what's there right now? And I think that if done well, this has some built-in insurance against that happening. The other reason I like it, and it just occurred to me while you were talking, is I'm now seeing a way to integrate that with some of the other suggestions we have hanging out there, right? One of the things that I think a wave system or a phase system like this does is it continues to push the game in a very arcadey feeling direction, right? And I think the idea of a multiplier on your score, like the crits or the increased crits or damage multiplier or something like that, kind of feels like it goes with that arcadey feel too, and that's another way we could bring that in and see about integrating that into the design. And now, and we remember we were talking a couple of days ago about, is there a way to do all of this stuff? Is it just like a random collection of features, or is there a cohesive theme? And now, as sometimes happens, a little bit of a cohesive theme is emerging for me, because I'm like, could the theme be making this game a little more arcadey or optimizing it for sort of an arcadey feel?
I love that idea. I mean, it already feels a little bit arcadey.
Yeah, it's like it'd be
In
like more of a step in that direction.
Yeah, yeah. And I just wanted to, for our viewers out there, just comment for a second on the design of arcade games. Because, of course, if you're younger, you may not have the same history with going to a physical arcade that folks like Brian and I do. I love arcades. Um, and one of the things to think about in designing an arcade game is the situation you're in when you start is you've put a quarter in. And the dynamic you encounter in the game is sort of related to that initial expenditure of money in order to play. So, the way a lot of, though not all arcade games work, is you have this difficulty ramp up where it gets harder and harder and harder and harder, hopefully hard enough that someone will continue to put money in and continue to put money in order to get to the end, and there's an end, because otherwise you're not going to put money in on and on, because there's no point in paying, because you would know that it's infinite. So you have this kind of balance between like enticing people to spend more, because when you die you end up having to put another quarter, but then also promising a satisfying conclusion. And then, of course, we have the technical possibility of what's called a one credit clear, which is if you really, really get good at the game, you can beat the entire game, go all the way to the end with just one quarter.
See, I did not know when I made this suggestion that I was talking to such an or co-presenting with such an aficionado of arcade games who was that deep in the design, and that's really useful because that definitely is not a particular area of design skill that I have. Though, like you, Natalie, I did spend some time in arcades when I was a lad, and I think that your expertise there is going to be really valuable, right?
Yeah, actually, and this is just a, in the category of like games we love. I love the game Spelunky. And if you've ever heard of that game, it's a 2D roguelike 2D platformer type game. And that game, although it you can play it on PC, and it's sort of a cross-platform, just amazing classic in the 2D genre, was designed with a 2D or an arcade sensibility. And I actually read a book about it where the designer talked about this whole concept of like the feeling of playing an arcade game and building that into a game, even that you don't play in an arcade, but that you enjoy for similar reasons. And it's very successful in the case of Spelunky.
Yeah, we could really rabbit hole on this from a design perspective. And I mean, rabbit holing would be bad, but some amount of thinking about it now quickly is probably useful. As you noted, the genre of fast paced shooter arcade game is a venerable uh, arcade genre. I'm thinking about games like Chrono Trigger or Time Crisis or any of those. You know those games? Dino Crisis,
Yeah.
where those are, where you've got this setup where you have, the physical um, blaster peripheral, right? So you're holding the blaster gun and you're shooting things. Sometimes they have the mechanic where there's a foot switch, and like you can press or release the foot switch to duck behind cover or stand up to shoot. Sometimes you're on rails, so the game moves you in the environment for you as you progress. Again, doing that, as we talked about before, could be challenging in a VR game, because when you have that motion that's not mapped to your physical motion, that's what makes players barf. But there's definitely a way. There are ways to incorporate some of those techniques, maybe even into the existing game that we have. If like the theme sort of here is arcade mode mod or arcade mode enhancement, because as you noted, it already has some arcadey dynamics to it.
Yeah, I love Time Crisis as an inspiration. I love that game. You know, and I think one thing that's particularly appealing about arcade games, and I think we could build in as a design sensibility for this game, is um, like, how do I say this? I guess like when you go to an arcade, there's all these games that you can play, and you don't have to delve deep into the lore and the like details of the world to really have fun with it. It's fast, it's goofy, and Time Crisis is such a perfect example of that because you pick up this like gigantic plastic pistol that doesn't look real at all, and you push on a foot pedal to get the guy to duck, and it's just like, oh, how long can you last? It's not like in a world where blah blah blah. It's just some fun interactions, and I think the point of it is just to be able to pick it up, and in the case of that game, doing it with a friend, so you can have this collaborative gaming experience. But I think in our game, like the idea there is like you just pick it up, and it's a really fun VR experience. That seemed kind of like easy entry vibe to it, I think, is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, and it's not. We're honestly, we're not philosophically, we're not that far off from that now because by design, because it's a VR game and because it's supposed to be a very simple game that new players could pick up quickly and understand the design of quickly, so that it can help be the basis for a modding project like this. We've got at least one foot in the door already in terms of the game kind of being like that. So I dig that. Ronan D asks, can you explain more why players can't move in VR? Can't you move in VR games like VR Chat and Super Hot? Yeah, so we talked about this a little bit the other day, Ronan, and I'll maybe do a quick recap, but fill in some other details that we didn't talk about. So, what doesn't work in VR is when your avatar is in continuous motion in the game world, but your body motion is not the same as that, right? So, as you note, in a game like Super Hot, you are in motion in Super Hot when you're actually playing. And if you move your hand or you duck your body or anything like that, your motion matches the motion of the avatar on screen. And the same is true in VR chat, like that. And in our VR shooter game that we have here, that works. What doesn't work is when those things don't line up. And the biggest way that those cannot line up is if you have to make big movements that are outside of the range you physically can move in your VR setup space, right? Or if you're playing VR where you don't move at all. So if you think about a game like VR Chat or Superhot, when you have a scene change, when you go to a radically different environment, when you move more than within the space that you're just standing in, what happens, right? It fades to black, and then you fade up in a new position or a whole new environment. And that's how most VR games handle when you have to make a big movement like that. Because if what you did instead was not have the physical real world player moving, but just moved the game's camera, what happens to the player is your eyes in the headset see the world move, but your body's inner ear, which is where your body detects physical motion, detects that you're not actually moving. So your eyes send your brain the message that you're moving. Your inner ear sends the message that you're not moving. And that's what makes people nauseous and gives them motion sickness, right? It's the same phenomenon of being on a ship and getting seasick, right? When you're below the deck of a ship and the ship is moving with the waves, your inner ear feels the motion, but your eyes don't detect. It's actually the reverse, right? Your eyes don't detect it because you're looking, everything around you inside the ship is not moving relative to your eyes, right? And if you get seasick like that and you go up on the deck and you look out at the horizon or you look at the ocean, then you're seeing in the motion and you're feeling it and you stop being nauseous.
Yep. Woof. It's a bad effect.
It's
And
it's a it's a bad effect and you don't want it. And so that's why you don't have big movements in VR unless you do that thing of fade to black, move the player. So sometimes in a VR game, if you want to give the player control of where they can go, you have, and I think VR chat does this, right? You have a teleporter mechanic. So
Yep.
you can use some control to say, I want to go there, right? Point in the world while you're stationary, point to where you want your avatar to go. But then when you say, okay, go there, it fades to black and then fades up and you've just teleported to the new position.
Yeah. So it's more like just a design constraint on the types of movement that you can do in VR and not precisely that you can't move at all.
Yeah. And again, in like a game like Time Crisis, you that's not an issue because the traditional Time Crisis arcade games, you're not in VR. You're looking at a screen, and there it's not a problem to have the camera move. So, and that's what typically happens. The camera, you're typically deposited in one place. You can shoot. You have the ability to like duck behind cover, and then when you clear the enemies at that checkpoint, there's a forced camera move which is effectively your character moving to the next location he's going to have cover. It just moves you, and then you start over again, and that's fine because you're not in VR. You're looking at a screen. It doesn't make you barf.
Yep, exactly.
So I think with that theme in mind, Natalie, let's look at our list and see what features really complement that more arcadey thing. This one is just fixing a bug, so that doesn't really count. My vote on this one is we do it if we have time, Natalie.
Yep, agree there.
Um, changing so definitely this enemy wave thing.
Yep.
So certainly having them spawn in waves. I think you would need. There's another interesting question here, so I'm just going to highlight those like in a color or something. Let's make those blue for stuff that kind of work with our design. Another thing that's often important to these arcade games, Natalie, when you have a wave or when you're going to get a multiplier, arcadey feeling games typically flash that right on the screen, right? It's like, new wave starting, or you see the countdown timer to when the new wave is going to start. Or when you get the multiplier, it's like 5x points or whatever it is. We talked about this extensively earlier in the week. In a VR game, there's not a screen to put stuff on. So if we want to do that, we got to find a diegetic way, right? In diegetic, as we talked about, meaning in world way, to convey that to you in a way that you're sure to see it.
Yep. I mean, I would love to try my idea of turning the lights on. I'm not totally sure it would work yet because I would need to look at the actual scene from the perspective of what you see when you're playing and determine how many of those lights are actually visible from that spot. But like what I have in my head is this. I'm kind of imagining like when you reach the end of a phase, you get like a electrical like kind of zapping thing, and then we turn on a point light positioned right near where the light bulb is on that 3D model. And then we also trigger an audio sound. Audio sound is a bit of a redundant term. We trigger audio that says it's sort of like electrical sound, but then also has kind of a good feeling to it so that it sounds like success.
So I will, and again, this is the time to have design debates, right? I'm nervous as to whether that's gonna read or not, right? And when I say so, that's a term at least I often use talking about designs. When I say something is going to read, I mean like whether that's going to come across or not, like whether a player is going to pick up on that and interpret that in the way you intend for them to interpret it. Because I worry if it's really going to convey, or as a technique, it could convey all the things we might want to convey. If that reads, I agree, that could convey like the end of a wave or progress towards the end of a wave and the start of a new one. But if we wanted to show someone that a multiplier was active, you need another mechanism to do that, right?
Yeah, yeah. I have a couple thoughts there actually. So one, the sort of default idea for any UI additions in this game is certainly to put them on the inside of the shield and to do some minor design work to accommodate more text on that shield interior, which I think is just like a dark square with some text on
Yeah.
it. Um, the other thing I realized when you were talking is I think in that game, I'd have to look at it again. There might be some like little things that look like what do you call these? Like electronic billboards, like the kind you see in New York City where it's
Yes,
a
there
vertical
are. Yeah.
screen. Yeah, it has like some alien text on it. It makes me wonder if we could appropriate one of those as an element of the UI, bringing it closer to where the player is and displaying some information about phases or multipliers on there.
Yeah, that class of solution is where my head went as well. You know, my instinct on this, and again, I'm working here very instinctually, so I don't mean to be dismissive of your idea, Natalie. I'm just, I'm because we know we don't want to spend weeks like trying and prototyping stuff, which I think you'd have to do on some of these ideas that we're both generating to see if they would work. Like I think that's what you'd have to do on the the lights idea if that was going to work and if it was going to read. You'd have to prototype and you'd have to play test it and that kind of thing.
Yep.
I'm trying to shortcut a little bit of that in the interest of time, so I'm probably leaping a little more prematurely than I normally would to solutions that I'm more confident would work, right? And essentially forcing a screen into the scene somewhere is an example of a technique I think is very likely to work, right?
Yep.
As you know, you could, I think using the one that's already on the inside of the shield is not going to work because as I think this idea came up previously, and as I said then, you can't guarantee that the player will look at their shield,
Right, right. Yep.
right?
Yep.
So I don't think that's going to cut it. I think possibly using one of the screens already in the game or putting a screen in the world at a fixed point in the game could potentially work, right?
Yep.
The solution I was thinking about, which I think is a little harder to do, but I'm more confident it would work, is if you imagined the avatar having like a little drone companion that hovered around him and had a screen on it or like projected a little virtual screen or something when key information needed to be conveyed, right? And if you did that, you could always be assured that it was on the camera when you needed it to be. Now, the problem with that's a possible solve because it solves for a number of things. Like the key one being you could always be sure that the UI was presented and visible to the player when it needed to be. The downside of that approach is if you want to do that well, there's going to be a lot of things you have to solve for about anytime you want to bring in an element that's going to take up space in the player's view and you're going to force it to be there, you run into all sorts of risks of is that going to block the player from being able to see things in the game. So imagine you were trying to like target the boss enemy, you know, and get your shots lined up, and then all of a sudden in pop this drone screen right where you were trying to aim. That's going to be super annoying.
Right, right. I mean, I wonder if you could do something where it is possible not to see it all of the time, but when something happens that's relevant and whatever is being displayed on that little drone screen is changing, you use the play audio clip at point function to, off in a direction, signal through sound that that thing is changing, and thereby sort of pull the player to like, and you wouldn't make it like really far away. You would just sort of have to need to like look 90 degrees to the right, and then it would be flashing or something, and you'd, oh, okay, right. So it would be something you're not seeing 100% of the time, but it would like strongly encourage you to look at it when you need to.
Yeah, I mean, that feels like a good compromise to me. You know, I think if you either had a screen in the world at a fixed point that was almost like your battle status screen or something,
Yeah.
like off to one of the sides of where the player is along that alley, and you had good audio feedback coming out of it when you had a message on it, or you know, audio and possibly visual feedback, because you could like flash a light source off camera that you would see the effects of that light flashing or something. um, that clued you to look at it. And you could either have that be off camera, or you could stick with it being on the inside of the shield, you know,
Hmm.
and have the shield like have, you know, a message indicator or whatever. Oh, the other thing you can do in VR, at least with the VR hardware that we're using, we wouldn't be able to see it in the game when we're testing it and we're playing it not in VR, but you can actually force the controller to vibrate.
Oh yeah, that's a great
So
one.
that the ability to do that kind of pushes that in the maybe you we do we'd have to revise it a little bit, but you do put it on the inside of the shield, and then it's almost on the analogy of like your shield has a little vibrating motor in it, like your cell phone does, right? Um,
Yep.
when you get notification, we push notifications directly to your shield. This is the iShield 12 or whatever it is.
That's right, a smart shield.
It's a smart. You have a smart shield, and we can push notifications to your smart shield. And I like that because you always have your shield. You can't put it down.
Yep.
It's right there. The metaphor when you had the motion controller, shaking the motion controller would work. Um, and we already have UI on the shield, and we have the basics of making UI work on the shield, so we wouldn't have to set that up again. We wouldn't have to set an alternate source. We'd have to tweak it so that there was enough room on it. But that could totally work. So
Yeah.
I'm a fan of that. Um,
I'm a fan of that too. I mean, and of course, the way we're going to prototype this, we're creating the little screen as its own object. And given sufficient time, if we were really going to iterate on this, we could create that screen and then put it in different situations, whether it's attached to the shield or, on a billboard or hanging from a drone,
yeah,
and see which one we liked the most. We probably won't do that with this project because we're only going to work on it for, the duration of this pilot. And, we're trying to keep it scoped appropriately.
right.
But, when I have these conversations about projects, I'm always like, yeah, let's just try it on the shield. And then because I understand how that's a separate object from the shield, I think we could detach it from the shield and try it as a drone if we didn't like how that worked.
Exactly. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and we can implement that in a way where the when we write this, the scripts to do that and to draw the UI, the target in terms of what I'm going to use some Unity terminology here. So when you have user interface things like that, like what's on the inside of the shield, right? When you create that user interface in Unity, you put it on something called a canvas, right? By analogy to a painter's canvas. And in Unity, whether that canvas is on a physical object in the game world, like the inside of the shield, or a TV screen you've placed in the game world, or whether that is a menu screen in the game when you're playing on a device with a screen and it's a menu screen, uh, it doesn't much matter. It's still the same UI canvas, and in your code and in your design, you interact with it the same way. And so having the system that renders all the UI for us and knows how to update it with the right messages and keep the point values up to date, we can create that system in a way that's pretty generic, and then have one of the things that you specify is what is the target. Is it this screen on the inside of your shield? Is it this screen on the drone? Is it if you were doing a version of it that was not for VR, is it a menu UI that the player sees but that isn't in the game world itself? That could be very generic.
Yep.
I like it.
Lots of
Yep.
options.
So I think the Shield UI with push notifications goes on this list then. I think we're not doing the store weapons upgrading thing. We said that was too scopy.
Yep, Scopy.
So I think we're saying here for this next one, a finite number of waves. Like, let's
with
say,
a boss at the end,
yeah,
right?
let's say there were 3 waves plus a boss fight. I think that works.
And that sounds reasonable for this round too. Obviously, if we were like, let's make this into a commercial game, we're going to add things like levels of difficulty, multiple levels, a whole arc of levels that you can play with different numbers of waves, different kinds of enemies. But like at this stage, we're not going to scope that because that's extra, extra, extra large to do that. We're just going to say, let's put in the minimum amount of waves and boss to test out this design idea.
Agreed. So I think I've summarized that as being a finite number of waves, like 3 plus a boss wave, and that the waves, to tie this to the next item, are triggered by reaching a certain point threshold. That covers the next one too. I think I want to do just this next one from this list because this would give you the support for the concept of random crits, and we'll say, I'll add to this a point multiplier. Those are relatively small
Yep.
changes.
Yeah.
We would be doing a boss type enemy if we did this.
And maybe not the other stuff down there because I feel like the discussion of power ups and weapon types, I would need to revisit that after trying these larger modifications to the rules of the game.
I agree.
Yeah, and not to say that they're not worth putting in, but the gameplay is going to feel totally different with these changes, and we may, for example, if a lot of the enemies, the dynamic of the enemies is textured and exciting, we may value the fact that the gun is always the same.
Agreed.
In fact, holding the gun as the same weapon reminds me a little bit of what we talked about with Ms. Rogers' game yesterday, in that that game held certain things the same intentionally to create that feeling of cohesiveness and consistency across different levels. And in a way, that would be like, oh, we have one gun, but we have multiple phases. That, in that example, the gun is the thing that stays consistent across the phases.
Exactly. Okay, this is cool. And I think this is a pretty reasonable list for what we could attempt to do in this mod. I think it shows an interesting range of stuff. Just thinking about it from putting my learning instructor hat on for a standpoint, I think this would let us showcase a number of key systems and coding concepts in Unity, which is not necessarily relevant to the design of the game, but I think is relevant to the fact that we're doing it in a class. So I like that about it. All right, I think I buy the items in blue, Natalie. Are you comfortable with that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at this and I'm seeing we have two large, one medium, one small medium, and one small, which seems like a good kind of range of depth
Yeah,
on these as well. If they were all large, I would be like, oh, scope creep. But
right,
I
right.
think the two that are large uh, can really be accomplished in the time that we've got. So I'm 100% on board with this.
I agree. So I think the last thing we need to do to sort of get out of pre-production here, which I think we can accomplish in the next 20 minutes or so we have today, and then I'll feel good about myself going into the weekend because we'll have accomplished what we set out to, is coming up with an implementation plan. So this step is something that I think a lot of people who are new to making games and new to making software, this is a step that is, in my opinion, hugely important to the process, and it's one of the top things you can do to set yourself up for success, right? Because before we go and start doing any of this work in Unity, we need to know the steps that are involved in doing each of the big things we've highlighted in blue, and we need to think about what the most efficient way to do it is. Now, as a new developer, doing this in a total vacuum is impossible, right? You need to know not only about your design, like Natalie and I have sort of worked out now at a high level, you need to know something about how you're going to implement these things in Unity. You need to know about the systems of your game. you need to know some of the technical details there, which is not stuff that as a new game maker you would know, right? And that's fine. And you wouldn't be expected to. But I still want to model the and demonstrate the process of going through that, because this is a crucial stage to any game making project. And again, I think personally, I think doing this well and knowing the order in which you're going to do stuff and what depends on other things and why you might have to do this before you do this other thing is the key to success in any project. Because if you do
Yeah,
stuff, you get that wrong, you're going to be hopelessly behind the eight ball right out of the gate, to mix my metaphors, and that's not gonna be fun.
that's right. Yeah, it's as if we're at a horse race and there's also pool,
If there's a horse race and there's billiards going on, then you're behind the eight ball right out of the gate, which makes it very hard to hit a home run. And
I know. Where's the bat? I mean, seriously.
yeah, I don't know. Um,
Yeah, I wanted to add on, I was just thinking about this because we always have this issue at our in-person studios, which is that the part that you and I just did is actually the fun part where you just come up with all these ideas and then you like make decisions of which ones you want to do. And then the strong temptation is at that moment to open the endless mission or to open Unity and just start doing it. And especially if you're learning the platform you're using and you're not a power user yet, that's kind of like the equivalent of, someone that's learning how to use a computer, just giving them the computer and being like, okay, now make a game. Unity is so complicated. And if you just sit down and sort of try to use it, you're facing the complexity of something like a computer, which can do all of this stuff. But for you to actually know what to do right now, you need to organize your thoughts a little bit further before you actually sit down at the tool. And from my personal experience, I can say this is the part where you need to be patient, because at this point, what I'm feeling right now is I'm feeling creative energy. Brian and I, we've agreed on what we want to do, and we're excited about this arcade style game. And if we don't exercise patience and instead just pop Unity open, we're going to get lost and confused about what to implement first. And that's what leads to it feeling overwhelming and large and, oh, I failed at my project. And the last thing you want to do is come out of this fun process with, oh, I'm a failure. And this thing we're about to do is the thing that will prevent you from feeling that way.
and just to stay on the soapbox for a minute, and I promise I'll try to keep it to maybe 2 minutes. I'll keep it to that. This is the difference between real game making and more broadly speaking, what I would call software engineering, right? And on the one hand, and just learning to code on the other hand, right? We want you guys who are in this program, we want you to be real game makers and real software engineers, right? We want you to be on the pathway to developing those skills. We want to set you guys up to be successful to do that, right? It's not just about learning how to write the code that we will need to write to implement an enemy wave system, right? We're builders. We gotta learn how to build our game, and doing that means, just like a real builder would, you gotta understand you gotta build the foundation before you build the second story, right? You gotta know how to build the foundation. And when you're like, well, the first thing I gotta do is dig a hole, and digging a hole, in coarse sand is different than digging a hole in if the ground is clay, right, or whatever. You got to know that kind of stuff and be prepared for that. And so what we're doing now is real software engineering stuff. We got to know our design well enough to understand it. We got to think about how we're going to go about doing these things. What are the tasks that are involved in doing them? What systems do we need to add to or build to make these things happen? And then once we know that, honestly, once you know that, the order in which you're going to do it is just going to fall right out of that, because you're going to go, yeah, I got to build the first, I got to have a foundation before I build the second story.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And I'm excited to figure out what is the foundation
All right, so let me climb
of
off my
the arcade
soapbox. Let me
house.
climb off my soapbox and we'll do that. Okay, So
Yep.
let's go through each of the features in blue and and we've done this for some of them earlier, but just do the quick feature breakdown to make that happen. Um, so when we talk about, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to start a separate section for this because I think it's going to get really confusing to keep doing it up there. So we'll call this feature breakdown. And the first feature we had to break down there was our wave system. We'll just say enemy waves, right? So we're going to need a system for managing waves, right? And uh, just to be clear, let's call that the wave manager, right? We're going
Yep.
to need a wave manager system, right? You know,
Yep.
this system needs to be able to do a few things. It has to be able to detect when the condition the conditions that trigger a new wave have been satisfied, right? And in the case of our game, we know that is a point threshold, right? So this has to be able to get information from where about your game's score to say, oh, you've got a certain score, and that is the trigger for me switching from wave one to wave two,
Yep.
right? The next thing it has to be able to do is it has to be able to trigger changes to the game associated with the start of a new wave. I'm expressing that very generically, Natalie, because right at this second, I don't know. I don't think we have a complete list of what all those changes might be.
Yeah.
Right?
I think we have to figure out what's characteristic to a wave. Like, we have some options of how many enemies are spawning at a time, uh, how much damage those enemies can do, how fast they can move. And what we haven't decided is like, um, which aspects of those are we using to create a difficulty curve, which I am assuming is a part of this, in that the wave one is easier than wave
Yeah.
two. So the initial thought I have is just that there's more enemies spawning per wave, but I'm not certain that's the only thing that we're going to change.
Yeah, I don't. I'm not certain about that. I do think these are. I mean, as you were talking, I was listing categories. Oh, and I see Dr. Farber is watching us today too. Who's a great game design, game making educator and scholar. I'm very excited that you're watching, Dr. Farber. Thank you, and I'm glad you're excited. I'm excited too. Um, I mean, I think those are the big categories, Natalie, in terms of what we want to watch out for, right? I think the rate at which enemies spawn, which enemies are spawning, and then the properties of those enemies. Um, I mean, you could also perhaps say which spawn points are active.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, I mean, we could just have there be a thing that turns more of them on as the waves progress.
Yeah. And then the other thing the other type of thing I think you need to be able to trigger is the UI feedback to the player, right?
Right.
So this would be, which really amounts to the what we're calling the push notifications.
The smart shield
Yeah, the smart
notifications.
shield. Let's call them that. Right, which is really the smart shield. I like that notification. Patent pending
Oh my gosh.
notifications.
It really reminds me of there's just such a cool trend I've noticed of games that have cell phones in them
Yeah,
as a UI element.
yeah,
Someone when we took our in-person game making studios online, we had a student that created a phone UI that had it looked like an iPhone and you could click on all the icons and actually do things in the game. And it was so cool. It was just such a fun story element.
Yes, I think if Tom Nook sends me another notification in Animal Crossing, I'm gonna mute him. But yes,
Is
that
there
is
a
a trend.
cell phone in that? I
Oh
haven't
yeah,
played the new one.
it's a major part of the interface. You know, it's you get messages, you have like your Critterpedia is on your cell phone, your achievements are tracked on your cell phone. It's well done, but it's you know you spend a lot of time on your cell phone.
Gosh, it's too real.
Um, yeah, you know it's that game hit close to home to me because it's like you during the pandemic because it's like you're stuck relatively close to your home, uh, and you spend most of your time staring at screens. So that's it. It's a gross
Oh
oversimplification
man.
of Animal Crossing. So I think it needs to be able to do all of those things, and maybe less obviously, and it kind of goes along with the first one, Natalie. So I'm just going to add it up above it. Is you have to maintain the current wave state, right? So this system not only does it need to know, okay, it's time to start wave two when it's time to start wave two, it needs to know that you're in wave one, right? And then you are in wave two. And you will hear this term a lot in game making and computer science, this use of the word state to represent that concept, right? It needs to know what condition it is. Where are we at, like right now? What is the state of the waves? We're in wave one versus we're in wave two, right? So I think that's kind of what you need for enemy waves. We need a wave manager system to do that, right?
Yep.
All right, let's look at the next thing on the list. So we have that covered. So shield push notifications is next. The smart shield, we'll call that.
Yep. Yep.
Okay, so to do the smart shield, I think one thing I know we need to do is we need to um, do the visual design of the revised shield UI. So we need to figure out what we want that the display to be shown on the display panel. What are the different ways that could look, and we need to make the modification so that it's big enough and it's ready to do that. So we need to have that part of it ready. We need a system, I think, and this is honestly really the only other part of this I can think once you have. Well, so I think that's one thing we need to do. We need to do the other thing we mentioned earlier, which is we need to I'm going to write it out and then I'll describe what I mean by it because I'm going to use some buzzwords here.
All right. I love buzzwords.
We need to abstract the display, put it in scare quotes, the display device layer from the notifications. Let's put it this way, from the message display layer, right? So this was the thing I was talking about. I want to change a little bit of the way the underlying behind the scenes architecture is working here so that there's one system, if you will, that manages what information the UI is going to display. I want to separate that from the where you display it.
Yeah.
So we need that. We need we need the notifications system, right? System, which is the key thing there is we need a way for other game systems to be able to push a message to the display, right? So this is in a very constrained way, in a mini way. This is going to work very much like notifications work on your phone. There's going to be there's one system on your iPhone, that's like, once I have the message, I know how to display that to you, right? And I know how to respect your notification. In that case, I know how to respect the notification settings. I know how to, make the phone vibrate, do all that stuff. So there's going to be one system that does that, but then that system is going to have a way for other game systems, like for example the Wave Manager, to be able to say, okay, cool, now I need you to just you can do that, display this thing now, right? So we need that system. And then we need, just so that for the sake of completeness, we want to make the motion controller vibrate when
Yeah.
messages are sent. Cool. So that's that one.
Yeah, I was just looking at that, and our third one on the list is actually part of the Wave
Yep, we already got
Manager.
that covered.
Yep. So crits is our
All
next
right, so
item.
crits and multipliers. So one thing we need to do is we need support in the weapon for crits. And we need support in the scoring system for multipliers. And then we need we need a design and system for applying and managing multipliers, and right, crits and multipliers for managing them. We'll just say managing, right? So how do we trigger when one is applied? How do we know the state of what's currently applied, and what are the rules for when they're applied, and how do we apply those rules?
Sounds right.
That's crits and multipliers. And then we have the
We have a
boss,
boss.
the boss enemy. All right. And so there we need to select, import, and set up the visuals for the boss, right? Well, I guess before we do that, we should define, we need a boss design. Whoops. Right? And we need to import the visuals, and then what I can say, Natalie, is almost anything we choose to do here, we're going to modify existing enemy scripts to enable desired boss behavior per design. And then, he needs to, we've already covered the task of integrating him with the Wave system.
Right.
And I think that's what we need.
Yeah. Well, just looking at this, I feel like this is a good illustration of why things can become X large.
Yeah.
This is fitting with my expectation of what we would need to do for these implementations. And you can see how if we started to map out something like a store where you buy things, how many bullet points we would end up getting deep in implementing a system like that.
Yeah, and what I would say, so I think that's the list, right? The last element we really need, and I actually think we can do this in a minute or two, maybe we'll go a little bit over our time today, but the last thing we need to say that I would officially get us out of pre-production and into production is we need to know the order in which we're going to do stuff, right? And what I would say is this is where you start looking at how things depend on each other, right? What I observed as we were going through that list is we could start almost any one of these high level bullet points. We could start doing any one of them in whatever order we wanted, right? But I don't think we can finish finish any of them, right? Until we first finish all the stuff under enemy waves, because everything else depends on integrating with the wave system to some degree,
Yep,
right?
I think that's right.
And so I think with that in mind, that may be enough to get us started. And here's where, Natalie, I'm going to suggest that we depart from maybe the strict order we would do this in if we were really going to do this just to do it. And we make maybe one minor diversion for learning purposes, because I think it will be a good place to start learning. And it's as good an order as any, because it's, you know, it's fine. It's not going to create any dependencies, which is, I would vote for doing these two things that I've just highlighted, the support in the weapon for crits and the support in the scoring system for multipliers first, right? And I say that because those should be relatively self-contained additions to existing systems that we have. And by doing that and starting with those existing systems, that'll be a useful way to introduce some of the Unity concepts we're going to be working with over and over again, because we'll have systems and stuff in Unity to start with where you can already see it in action, and we're going to add to it.
Right. Yeah, ordinarily we'd probably start with the wave manager, but we want to get into some of the basics so you guys can follow us when we start building out that bigger system.
Yeah, I think, I think we should start there, and then, you know, we could go to the wave manager and do the whole wave manager thing. There's also, and again, these are things I'm thinking about because they might make the live stream more fun. Because I do think we have a lot of choice, because we can do a bunch of, and the reality is, if you're doing this on a big game team, a bunch of these things would be happening at the same time.
Yep.
So we could go from that to the wave system, or we could go from that to maybe doing some design on the boss and selecting visuals of the boss, because that's kind of fun, and we could, you know, show the import process and bring the new boss model into the world once we have one, which is kind of fun and visual and a little less codey than some of the other things. Maybe that's a good way to shake things up, right? But what I think is crucial is I wouldn't do much more than that before I had done a bunch, if not all, of the stuff under enemy waves. And what I do think is I would do Smart Shield last.
Mm-hmm.
I almost certainly think I would do Smart Shield last.
I think that's right because, doing UI design and integrating UI with the other systems of the game, it's just a little bit more technical in a way, and it always feels like sort of a surface thing, even though you really need it. And I always find myself working on that at the end, like once I have a really clear mental picture of how the rest of the game
Yeah,
works.
especially because there are other systems that it depends on. I think that, as you say, it's more, the pattern that you're seeing us describe, and I think this is a good way to end for today, Natalie, because we're a little over our time. The pattern that you're seeing here in general is we're thinking things through first, and then we're going to build the core systems or extend systems that we have that we know we need first, right? And that's like building the foundation of the house, right? So we're going to do that stuff first. And a lot of what Natalie and I are talking about now is really identifying which systems are really core, because we got to do it first. So we're going to do that first. And again, because the wave system is so much depends on it, and it really is the foundation of the changed gameplay we're going to have. That's why we got to do that first, right? And then you can move on to things that depend on those and are a little less central. And then some of the things you can do last are purely cosmetic things, right? Because the reality is, we could implement a bunch of the new boss's behavior and when it spawns and its integration with spawning in the wave system. We could do all of that and use the existing drone character model for our boss and just make it 50% bigger, right? Just so we could tell them apart,
Right.
and then bring in the cosmetics of the new boss we want at the very end. That would work too, right? And then any
Absolutely.
deviating we're doing from that order is because we know it's safe and we think it might make the learning easier or the live stream more fun, which we're allowed to do because
Yeah.
that's why we're here. Okay, so Natalie,
Yes.
I am satisfied. I believe we accomplished our tasks for today. and we only went 5 minutes
Yeah,
over.
only 5 minutes. That's a dream.
Cool. So seeing that we are over, I will say thanks for watching and thanks for participating in the first week of the program, and have a wonderful weekend, and we will see all of you on Monday.
See you
All right. Bye bye.
guys.